me tell you right off the top that you can turn things in until the 7th of May. After the 7th of May, I need to grade all this stuff. So if you still have something outstanding, postings or maybe your paper, then you need to have them in by the 7th of May. And that's it. That's as far as that's all you need to know. Okay, we're talking about today's kind of an unpleasant lecture since we have to talk about people dying. But you know, it's part of life. Every religion has their own way of looking at things. I was thinking about this a few minutes ago, and I was thinking, you know, even if you're Danae, even if you don't like to talk about this stuff, you're going to be dealing with clients who are, if you're going to be a psychologist, of course, or if you're working in public health. The reality is that I thought that when I got into medicine that I'd be dealing with saving people's lives, and for the most part I was, but the other part of my job had to do with watching people die and actually I worked in the morgue and I've worked in cemeteries before. So um, it's just part of life. Death is part of life. It's the last part of life, but it's still part of life, and we need to talk about it. Uh, Dancing around it really doesn't do anybody any good, especially if you're dealing with clients who are feeling like they need some help. So let's go ahead and get started. I tried to be as sensitive as I possibly could with the lecture. I won't talk about any of my experiences, probably. I'll try not to anyway. Um, well, I can tell you that when my wife was stationed in California, I worked at the Riverside National Cemetery, and while I was working there, I worked there for about a year. Oh, I saw a lot of people being buried, of course, and I helped bury a number of people. But I saw a lot of different religious practices. It was really fascinating, and as far as that goes, it's really interesting to see the different religions and how they handle things and how they handle things differently. Of course, national cemeteries, they have their own rules, so it was really kind of fascinating to see people negotiating as to how this was going to happen, because you know this is the way we do things, and the cemetery trying to do everything they could to make their experiences pleasant, but or as appropriate as possible. But you know, something federal government has their own rules, so sometimes it was kind of push and shove. But we got everything done. I can't remember anybody ever complaining about the treatment that they received at the cemetery. And this is in Riverside, California. My wife was stationed at March Air Force Base. So let's go ahead and get started. The Desk of Life, chapter 13, last chapter. Okay. As recently as the turn of the 20th century, 50 out of every 1,000 people in the United States died every year. That's a lot of people. In Europe, during plagues and natural disasters, as many as 40% of the population might die. One-third of all babies died in infancy, and this was at the turn of the 20th century. One-third of all babies died before they were 1 year old in 1900. 50% of children died before their 10th birthday. Death was normal, and death was expected because it was so common. During the 20th century, advances in medicine, from surgical techniques to antibiotics, reduced death rates and increased life expectancies all over the world. Death rates have now fallen to 9%, and infant mortality is below 1% in the United States, and that's something that you need to know. Right now, infant mortality in the United States is below 1%. Children rarely succumb to childhood illnesses. Adults most often live to retire. And older individuals now are given the medicines to fight off formerly fatal illnesses. I can remember when while I was growing up, a lot of people died of cancer and heart disease, but they didn't know that they had heart disease. Usually they figured out they had cancer before they died, of course. But the heart disease, a lot of heart attacks, just tons and tons of heart attacks, people dying in their 40s and 50s, and this was fairly common. And now we know, of course, it probably had something to do with the fact that they smoked and the fact that they weren't controlling their cholesterol level. The first generation to reach adulthood with only 5% of the population ever experiencing death in their presence was the baby boom generation, children born between 1946 and 1964. And of course, that was me. I was born in 1949, so I was part of the baby boom generation. It was the first generation where people didn't die at home. Only 1 in 3 people died at home. People rarely thought of their own deaths. Today, however, deaths tend to be getting closer to people as violence, drug abuse, COVID-19, and AIDS becomes more prevalent. There are at least 3 aspects of death. There's biological death, social death, and psychological death. Biological death, the definition of death is when the bodily functions cease, the heart stops beating, you stop breathing, and your brain activity has stopped. Social definition of death, the basic social attitudes toward death, of course, those are the social aspects, and the psychological aspects, both for the dying and for their bereaved. Before modern medicine allowed physicians to maintain a dying patient indefinitely, biological death took place when the heart stopped beating and respiration ceased. The brain was starved for oxygen, and all living functions stopped. Now we have the capability of breathing for an individual and maintaining a heartbeat indefinitely. Life support can be maintained indefinitely despite the fact that the brain has no awareness. Because of our ability to maintain people indefinitely, the American Medical Association developed new definitions for death. Irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory function was one, and irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. And of course, this is one of the things that we do when we're trying to determine if somebody has died. However, people can live for an extended period of time with only their brainstem functioning, a state referred to as a persistent vegetative state. And of course, you hear of these people from time to time, that people are in a persistent vegetative state. And usually what they'll do is they'll pull the plug and they'll allow them to die rather than keeping them going for one reason or another. Social aspects of death and dying. Many social aspects of death and dying are governed by religious or legal prescriptions that tend to reflect a society's attitude toward death. Embalming is a social custom that has become a law in most states. The Jewish practice of standing watch or shomer over the deceased until they are buried is also a social custom. I have had Jewish friends, and shomer is something that is supposed to happen. There has to be somebody with the deceased at all times. Another thing that Jewish people do is they cover their mirrors. And any reflective glass they cover so that you can't so that the spirit of the individual can't see themselves and or not see themselves, I guess. Psychological aspect of death. Psychologists feel that the people use rituals surrounding death to give themselves something to do when someone dies instead of feeling hopeless. Some rituals allow for extended contact with the dying or the dead and reaffirm the strength and efficacy of the community. In the Jewish community, friends and relatives gather at the deathbed to lend support to the dying, and this is known as Shema or Vidwi. I may be mispronouncing those words. I've never really heard them spoken before. In the Jewish community, when a friend or relative dies and someone hears of their death, they ritually tear an article of clothing that they will wear for the rest of the day, and this is known as keri-ah. After the funeral, a group of male relatives, at least 7, will gather and share and vent feelings of the deceased, and this is known as sitting Shiva. All of these rituals help the bereaved confront the reality of death, as you can imagine. The study of death is called thanatology. Many people believe that people must not only learn to deal with the death of someone close to themselves, but also their own death as well, and this is known as death education. Hospice care is care given to someone in a controlled setting, but outside the hospital. Some hospice care is provided in spatial housing where medical care is available. Other hospice care is at home by medical professionals. And this, my wife's cousin just died, not a couple weeks ago. I guess it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. My wife was down in Georgia with her cousin for about 6 weeks before she went into hospice. As soon as she went into hospice, my wife came home, and she died within the week in hospice care. So, that's the way things go, the way things work. But it was really kind of interesting that my wife was down there helping take care of her while she was still relatively functional and relatively communicative. As soon as that ceased, then my wife came home, and we waited for the phone call. Actually got a text message. Throughout most of the 20th century, medicine allowed people to get farther and farther from the death. People died in a hospital away from all but the closest relatives. But the AIDS epidemic in the early 80s changed all that as more and more people contracted the nearly always fatal disease and expired slowly. And sometimes it was extremely slowly. Sometimes it took them years, a couple of years to pass over. To cross over, to pass away. Okay, I got my adjectives wrong. The process of slowly declining to death is referred to as a death trajectory. Anything, if you throw a rock up in the air, and the arc that it takes is known as a trajectory. And so anything is a trajectory. You have a trajectory as far as your education is concerned. If you're trying to get everything done really fast, then your trajectory is fairly up and down. But if you're taking a little bit more time, it's more angled. Lingering pattern of dying. The individual is expected to die but clings to life longer than expected. These are death trajectories. Short reprieve pattern. The person's death is postponed unexpectedly. Cancer goes into remission, but the reprieve tends to be short-lived. And actually, this is what happened to my wife's cousin. She had breast cancer, and she started developing tumors. As long as she was being treated for the breast cancer, they had the breast cancer under control. But these other tumors that she developed, they couldn't control them, and they started bleeding. Anyway, she eventually she died of the tumors rather than the breast cancer. Abrupt surprise pattern. The individual is expected to recover but unexpectedly dies, and that's usually what happens with heart attacks. I had a friend when I first came to Diné College. I had a friend that had a heart attack. He had the same heart attack I did. He had a heart attack in exactly the same vein and exactly the same spot. And I think I've told you this before. He had 87% occlusion. I had 93% occlusion. He was expected to recover, but because he smoked cigarettes and because his veins, his blood vessels were so used to shrinking and expanding and shrinking and expanding, he didn't exercise, but he did smoke cigarettes. As soon as he had his heart attack, the blood vessel pretty much collapsed, and that was it for him. They kept him going for about 12 hours, but he eventually died. The doctor thought when he first came in with his heart attack, and they found out where it was, they figured they could help that he would recover. He still had 13% blood flow in that blood vessel. But because he smoked, that blood vessel constricted, was used to constricting, and that's exactly what happened. It constricted and it blocked off that 13%. Me, on the other hand, when I had my heart attack, I only had 7% blood flow, but because I lift weights and I don't smoke, it was used to expanding. So as soon as the heart attack occurred, it, instead of reflexively contracting, it reflexively expanded, and that's pretty much what saved my life. Actually, I had my heart attack, and I didn't really do anything about it for about 24 hours. And then when I went in, they kept, well, you know how doctors are. You ought to be dead, that kind of thing. I'm not. Suspended sentence pattern. A person was in the hospital to die, but is suddenly discharged from medical care because the crisis has passed, and that's what happened with me. Re-entry pattern. The person steadily declines, but is able to remain home between periods of hospitalization. And there you go. The terminally ill will often pass through 3 phases. The acute phase is a crisis that causes the high stress and increasing awareness of the inevitability of death. Chronic phase is an adjustment period when the individual resolves their feelings toward their own demise. And the terminal phase is where the individual withdraws from others and disengages from the world. And the terminal phase we used to call terminal drop. I'm not sure if I'm going to say that, but terminal drop was the term that we used for it when I was working in medicine. We would have individuals that we were dealing with, as you could tell, you can tell when they were getting close because they would stop interacting with people. And it was because they were marshaling all their energy to stay alive. When the individual enters a terminal phase of the death process, often they will notice marked accelerated cognitive degeneration. This is called terminal drop or terminal decline, when the focus tends to be inward and the individual stops eating or drinking, or at least has to be reminded to do all those things. And of course, that was what we were dealing with when I was working in medicine. The top 10 causes of death in the United States in 1900. Number 1 was pneumonia. It was the number 1 killer in the United States. Number 2 was tuberculosis, number 2 killer in the United States. Number 3 is diarrhea and enteritis. Number 4 was heart disease. Number 5 was chronic nephritis. Nephritis is a disease, or Bright's disease. It's a disease of the kidneys. Number 6 is unintentional injury, accidents. Number 7 was stroke. Number 8, disease of early infancy. Number 9 was cancer. And number 10 was diphtheria. So pneumonia and tuberculosis, number 1, number 2 killers in 1900. Leading cause of death in the United States of people over 40 now is number 1 is cancer, 31.5%. Number 2 is heart disease, 21.7%. Number 3, unintentional injuries, 7.6%. Number 4 is diabetes, which is tied with strokes at 3.6%. People face their own death differently. In young adulthood, people tend to feel invulnerable. They maintain a personal fable. Thus, when other adolescents die, the usual reaction is, it can't and won't happen to me. While this attitude tends to become more realistic, the more responsibility the individual acquires, job and family, there is still an air of invulnerability in their actions. When I was a teenager, I dated the individual that I would eventually marry. Her sister, her younger sister actually, dated a lot more than she did. And one time she went out on this date, and there were 3 couples in the car, and they were driving way too fast, and they went over a railroad. A place where the road crossed the railroad, and they hit it too fast, and the car became airborne, And when it came down on two wheels, and it skidded into the ditch. And four of the people in the car were killed. My sister-in-law wasn't even hurt. She was she wasn't even hurt, but none of them had seatbelts on, and the four people in the back seat flew out. She was in the front seat as a passenger, and the driver was okay, and the passenger was okay, but the four people in the back seat flew out and were killed. Real strange situation. Why am I talking about this? Oh, but even after that, she always felt that she couldn't be killed, that she couldn't be hurt. She felt invulnerable, even though she was, I don't know, 14 or 15 years old at the time. By the time someone reaches middle adulthood, they're usually resolved that they will someday die. These individuals begin looking at how much time they have left instead of toward the future. If I would live as twice as long as I am, wait a minute, if I'm only halfway through my life at this point in my life, I'm 72 years old, then I would live to be 144 years old. Well, that's not very likely. Nobody's ever lived that long, so probably I'm on the back side of the hill. I'm on my way down the hill. So and I accept that. I figure I'll live into my hundreds, but which will give me about 30 more years. But that's my wife thinks that she's only has about 10 years left, which is kind of interesting. So we have different philosophies. These individuals begin looking at how much time they have left instead of toward the future. People begin planning for retirement and accumulating money to see them through in their old age. Middle-aged individuals begin working towards saving as much time in life as possible. The phrase "life is just too short" enters the vocabulary, and I've been saying that for about 20 years, I guess. As people get older and move into late adulthood, they become less anxious about death. They're more likely to use emotion-focused coping strategies. With the mounting losses of friends and relatives, the individual gradually recognizes their own mortality. Many are old and infirm, but they seem to be coping with their situation. 2 out of 3 people surveyed as to whether they would trade good health to die earlier took the time alive over the good health. Approaching death, psychological changes often take place even before there are overt physiological signs of dying. Terminal drop often appears at this time. It is the acceptance of mortality, the seeming impairment of intellectual abilities, and the distancing oneself from friends and family. Terminal drop is often attributed to chronic ailments, but it is seen in people of all ages who are near death, not just the old. And I have some really sad stories, but I'll only tell you one. I used to work in a children's hospital, and at the time we couldn't treat leukemia. Well, we could treat leukemia, but it was only successful some of the time. And we had this 3-year-old that came in with leukemia, and we experienced terminal drop with her. We could tell when she was about to die because of the terminal, because she stopped paying attention to her mother. She was a 3-year-old. Real tough working in children's hospitals, let me tell you. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross from Cornell University did studies on thanatology and discovered that most people go through 5 stages before they die. The first stage is denial. I'm not going to die. I'm going to beat this cancer. The second one is anger, where they get angry at the disease, they get angry at the medical community, they get angry at just about everyone. And then they start bargaining. They start bargaining for more time. If you allow me to live, I'll do this or I'll do that. And then, of course, when the bargaining doesn't work, then they go into depression. But most people, and I've watched thousands of people die. Most people just accept it. One day they're sad, and the next day they're going, okay, well, I mean, that's the way everything works, and that is the way everything works. So the vast majority of people accept the fact that they're going to die. Thanatologists have discovered that people actually attempt to hold on to life until they reach a certain milestone date. Very often, the milestone date is a birthday or an anniversary, because this is going to be on their tombstone, whether they lived 80 years or 79 years. Um, Sometimes it's their wedding anniversary. It was horrible working graveyard shift on Christmas Day or New Year's Eve, because so many people made it to the New Year, and then they died. They held on until they could put that next year on their tombstone, and then they just gave it up. Which is, I mean, that's normally the way it works. People, uh, you can hold on until you're ready to go. My own dad was sick, and he was in pretty bad shape, and he's fighting for his life. And he asked my mom, "Is it okay if I go?" And she said, "Sure, if you're ready." And he said, "I'm ready." And about 15 minutes later, he died. So that's the way my dad worked. Religious people tend to hold on. Yeah, and the other thing, interesting thing about my dad, uh, I was working up in Montana at the time. I was teaching up in Montana, and he died Tuesday. He died Tuesday, and so he died on Tuesday, so that I could go to his funeral. If he had waited until Wednesday, then it would have been into the next week. If he died on Monday, then I would have had to have taken the whole week off. But as it worked out, he died on Tuesday night. I worked on Wednesday and left on Thursday, and his funeral was on Friday. So I only missed one day of work, uh, because of because of him, and he had that all worked out. He's kind of a cool guy. Religious people tend to hold on until select religious holidays, Ramadan, Christmas, Easter, that kind of stuff. Thanatologists don't want to make the studying of death too easy. They have taken words that seem to mean the same thing, and given them different definitions. Bereavement is the loss of someone to whom one feels close, and the process of adjusting to it. That's bereavement. Bereavement can affect all aspects of someone's life, including their social or community status or their roles. Grief is the emotional response experienced in the early stages of bereavement. Grief can range from anger to emptiness. Both grief and bereavement tend to be defined through cultural contexts. Now, interestingly, the APA has just come up with a new form of mental illness. It's called extreme grief, I think. Uh, yeah, it's extreme grief. Most people handle the loss of someone, a parent, a spouse, even a child, fairly well. They usually get over it after a number of weeks or months. Sometimes they don't suffer at all. But there are some people that have prolonged grief, and I'm trying to think what that's called. Let me see if I can find it. I should have looked this up before class. Um, Prolonged grief syndrome. Creative family members, what are the symptoms of prolonged grief? Yeah, it's called prolonged grief disorder. There it is, right there. Prolonged grief disorder. This is brand new. I mean, it just came out last year. Um, Prolonged grief. Oops. I know. I'll do this. There we go. All right. Mourning is the behavior that an individual participates in after the death of a loved one. This is very much culturally dictated. The Irish have all-night wakes where friends and family toast the memory of the deceased. It's a big party, actually, what it is. I used to work on the Fort Belknap Reservation, and evidently they got they mix their traditional way of dealing with death with an Irish priest. Catholicism is big on the reservation, so they hold wakes, which is really kind of interesting, and a feed. They'll have a feed, and the deceased will be sitting right there, or will be laying there in the coffin. Sometimes it's open, sometimes it's closed, but people will come in. Irish wakes, there tends to be a lot of alcohol, or a little bit, depending on how Irish they are, I guess. But on Fort Belknap, they didn't allow drinking on the reservation. The wakes were always held in the gymnasium of the on the reservation. They had a big gym where they had the powwows, and that's where they always had the wakes. If it was a military member, a veteran had to sit with them, and sometimes I got tapped. Being the last guy they called, I always got the worst, the worst times. I was always there from like 2 in the morning until 6 in the morning, or something like that, and then somebody would come and relieve me. Flying a flag at half-staff is an example of mourning. In Japan, the bereaved are encouraged to maintain contact with the deceased. They cremate their dead and place the urns in family burial plots. They create shrines to their ancestors in their homes and feed them as if they were there. Some Southwestern Native Americans do not speak of the dead for fear of being contaminated by their dead spirit. Patterns of grief. Anticipatory grief is the feeling of anticipatory loss that people feel before someone dies. Anticipatory grief is actually adaptive in that it tends to help the individual prepare themselves psychologically and practically for the loss of their friend or relative. Thanatologists studying the process of grief discovered a 3-stage pattern. The first stage is shock and disbelief. This may last several weeks, especially if the death was unexpected. The individual feels lost and confused. They seem to be unable to believe in the death. This may actually protect them from more intense reactions. Normal physical reactions may include shortness of breath, tightness in the chest or throat, nausea, feeling of emptiness in the abdomen. The numbness will eventually give way to overwhelming feelings of sadness, and at that stage they can cry. Stage 2, preoccupation with the memory of the dead person. The second phase may last 6 months or more. The survivor is trying to come to terms with their loss, but cannot yet accept it. Physical reactions include insomnia, frequent crying, fatigue, loss of appetite. They may relive their lives together and their entire relationship. At times, the survivor may feel that the deceased is present, even to the point of seeing their face. These episodes diminish with time, as do the vivid dreams of their relationship together. The last is resolution. The final phase arrives when the bereaved renews interest in everyday activity. Memories of the deceased now bring fond feelings mingled with sadness, but it's no longer a sharp pain and longing. They will become socially active again. This is especially important in widowers. Widowers are men that have lost their wives, in that they tend to have a less entwined social network. Women tend to have a more entwined social network. Grief therapy is counseling that can help the bereaved cope with their loss. So normally this process takes place. It can take place in a month or 3 months or 6 months or a year. That's fine. The prolonged grief is, and I guess I should have read that, but they're stuck in the second phase, or the first stage or the second stage, for a prolonged period of time. And that's prolonged grief disorder. What was I going to say? I was going to say something. I can't remember. There are many misperceptions about death, dying, and grieving. Researchers have discovered that depression is far from universal. Only 15 to 35% of grieving survivors show signs of depression. Failure to show distress at the outset does not necessarily lead to problems. In fact, the people who showed the most distress were more likely to still be troubled after 2 years. And this is the prolonged grief disorder. Not everyone needs to work through a loss or benefits from doing so. Some people who worked together, worked through their grief, had the most severe problems. So it really all depends. Surviving spouses, not only do women tend to live longer than men, but in the majority of marriages in the United States, the woman marries an older man. I've always married an older or younger woman, and all of them were 2 years younger than me. Yeah, well, one was 5 years younger than me. Anyway, widows tend to be worse off economically than widowers. In the United States, 40% of women over 65 are widowed. In the United States, 14% of men over 65 are widowed. Among women who are over 85, 80% are widowed. Among men 85, only 43% are widowed and not married. The average white woman is widowed at 56, African American women at 49, and Hispanic women at 48. Losing a parent, half of all children become orphaned by the time they are in their mid-50s. And my father died in, 2008. And my mom died in 2014. So I'm an orphan now at 72. But I was 51? I was 59 when my dad died. And I was 5 years later, 64 when my mother died. 75% by the time they reach their 60s. So that's me. I fit the demographics. Grieving for parents may last longer than for other deaths. 25% of bereaved adults still have emotional problems 1 to 5 years after the death of their parent. This included sadness, depression, and thoughts of suicide. And of course, that's not me. 50% continued to have physical reactions in the form of illness, fatigue, and general decline in health. And of course, my family doesn't do that. We get over the loss of our parents. When my dad died, my mom was there, of course, and she told us if anybody cries, you're in trouble. So none of his kids cried. It was the in-laws that cried, but none of his children cried. And when my mom died, she refused to have a funeral. So we had what do we have? We had a reflection day or something, like 6 months later. No, it's about 3 months later. Euthanasia is the act of allowing, but that's my family. My family's a lot different. We're not religious, so we don't have a church telling us how we're supposed to grieve, to tell us how sad we're supposed to be. So it's a little easier for us, I guess. That and the fact that my mom was a nurse, so she dealt with death every day. And I worked in medicine for 30 years, so I had watched this process, and I knew all the ins and outs and ups and downs of dying. So a lot of times death is a relief. My goodness, to the suffering, of course. Euthanasia is the act of allowing or assisting someone to die. Euthanasia has been practiced in the United States for decades. Doctors who have wanted to stop the pain and suffering of a terminal patient would merely stop making overt attempts to keep them alive. Withholding or discontinuing life-sustaining treatment is known as passive euthanasia. Dr. Jack Kevorkian, however, actively assisted people in seeking their deaths, and this is known as assisted suicide. Even before Erickson, people tended to review their lives before they died. This is referred to by thanatologists as a life review. Life reviews seemed to be beneficial for all people, but especially for those who looked back and saw a true purpose in their lives. These tended to be the people who feared death the least, and of course, that's me. I'm a teacher, and I've helped some people, and I've worked in medicine, and I've helped people. So when I have my life review, and maybe I'm delusional, but when I have my life review, I'm sure that I'm going to look back on my life and be really happy. Um, you know, I had wonderful wives. I've had great kids, and everything's been real positive as far as that goes. Ritual is important for Hinduism, which includes bathing the body with holy water and draped with white cloth, sprinkling rice on the mouth, cremation with only men present. Ashes are scattered, and on the 31st day, a memorial service is held. So, 31 days after somebody dies, then they have a memorial service. Buddhism rituals include presence of monks is important, of course. Bathing ceremony after death, cremation once again, feast held on the day of cremation, continual prayers performed by monks, and of course that's the monk's job is to pray continually during the service. Judaism tends to have a community of volunteers. Body is washed and purified. The body is dried and wrapped in linen. Family members enter a 7-day mourning period, followed by a second 30-day period. The coffin can have no nails and no handles, which makes it a little bit interesting. And of course, I told you I worked at the Riverside National Cemetery. Well, some of the people that we buried were Jewish. And it gets a little tricky because their people are heavy, and so are the coffins. But Jewish coffin you had to handle, tough to handle, just really tough to handle. We usually buried somebody with what, 8? Yeah, 8. We had 3 on each side. There are straps underneath, of course, and we're lowering the person into the grave. So there were 6 people, 3 on each side, and then there were 2 people at the head and the foot, holding on to the coffin. There was a bit of a trick with Jewish coffins. Most coffins have handles, so it's a little bit easier to deal with. 2 major mourning traditions in Christianity: Catholic anointing of the sick, followed by a vigil and a requiem mass is held. The Protestants, they may have a funeral service, which includes a eulogy. Protestant tradition is less ritualized than Catholic tradition, and there you go. Islamic rituals include gathering near the deathbed, reciting the Quran. The body is bathed and burial takes place shortly after death. Cremation is forbidden. Body is laid on the right side facing Mecca. 3-day mourning periods with the wives mourning for 4 months and 10 days. Hindu, year anniversary of death of the deceased. Their favorite food is prepared. Buddhists have, of course, ancestor worship that we referred to before. Jewish, Yarzeit, candle lit for 24 hours and prayer recited 3 times. Christian 3-day period called All Hallows Eve. All Hallows Eve is right around Halloween, which is why that's what Halloween means, All Hallows Eve. So the day before, let's see, All Hallows Eve is Halloween, and then the next day is the Day of the Dead. Wait a minute. The 1st of November, wait a minute. Okay. Anyway, there's 3 days. And the down in Mexico, they celebrate all 3 days. Halloween, the Day of the Dead, and then whatever the next day is. I'm not sure. Muslims visit the graves, show respect, and offer prayers to their dead and dying. And that's the end of the chapter. There you go. Okay, I had a good time this semester, not especially with this lecture, but with most of my lectures. So thank you for being a good class. Thank you for not complaining about anything that I've said or done. If you do have any complaints, just email me and I'll try to revise something. I know this lecture might be a little hard to take. So thank you, and get everything in by the 7th of May. That'd be great. And I'll see you next semester or in the summer if you happen to want to take any of those classes.